In this next short lesson, I'd like to look at the nature of language in general and the Hebrew language and Greek language more specifically, and the ways in which an understanding of the origins and the nature of language can help inform our reading of scripture and literature in the Bible. So when we look at the nature of language and seek to understand not only how narratives, poetry, wisdom, and other literatures work and how stories and narratives work, can be helpful to reflect on what we mean by language. What's the purpose of language? We could also study the philosophy of language and the possible origins of language and how language is used in different ways at different times in different cultures. We could ask, how did humans first develop this complex language of 20,000 or more words? How does the language in one culture compare to another? How does it even compare to animal vocalizations and bodily communication by animals, barks and howls and calls and arching of the back and growling? Animals often make use of a number of different sounds and signs, but humans can use oral language of 20,000 or more words and written symbols such as the word dog, hund, shine, cane, perro to describe a creature. And there's little information in these words about the creature. We need to understand something of the culture and the background and the ways that language is used by reading other examples of the use of that term at that time. Language is a complex system, oral language of sounds and written language of symbols, that has many levels of organisation, from phonetics, the sounds that are used, to syntax, the grammar, relationships between the words in sentences and paragraphs, and semantics, the meaning that is being communicated. Many theories have been proposed for the origins of human language, and the following terms, first used by Max Muller and George Romanes a century ago, have developed concepts to help understand possible origins and meanings of language today. The Mama Dada theory of language suggests that as children grow from infants to 6 months and more of age, the very first sounds develop into the words that are used. And in Hebrew and Greek, words such as dada and abba become the words that are used later for father, and similar with other infant words. The Tata theory of language, similarly, influenced by Richard Piaget and Charles Darwin, the evolutionist, says that body movement of the tongue imitates body movement in gestures, and this precedes the development of language. They propose that unconscious vocal imitation of physical body movements as children grow older helps to develop language. And if you watch a child mouthing movements when they start to use scissors for the first time, or a grimace when they lift a heavy object, then you could see that words could possibly originate in these ways. The Bow Wow theory of language by Max Muller says that people often use words to imitate sounds such as moo, choo choo, crash, clang, buzz, bang, and meow. These sounds imitate the objects that they're seeking to describe. The poo-poo theory of language says that interjections and responses and ow and arch and surprise and pain can be expressed in language. The ding-dong theory similarly says that sharp, high things tend to have words that have sharp, high frontal vowels at the front of the language, while big, round, low things tend to have big, round, low vowels formed in the back of the mouth. And so itsy bitsy, teeny weeny, if you didn't even know the meanings of those words, you get an idea that it's something small. And moon, you get an idea that it's something large, such as the moon in the sky. A yee-hee-ho theory of language suggests that language began as rhythmic chants, and A.S. Diamond suggests that these were perhaps calling for assistance and cooperation between people. Similarly, a sing-song theory of language suggests that language comes out of play and laughter and courtship and emotional mutterings and the like. Hey you theory of language suggests that language develops in interpersonal contact, and language begins as sounds to signal both identity, here I am, and belonging, I'm with you, and calling out and crying out, both in fear or anger or hurt or anticipation. Help. Other words are associated with relationships and emotions. Hocus pocus suggests that it could be associated with ancestors, religious or magical aspects. And eureka theory says that people discover words that reflect concepts they're wanting to communicate. Even in recent times, the last few years, we've seen that new technologies develop language that's sometimes associated with the technology and the things they do. In Genesis 2:20, Adam, the first human, gave names to the livestock, the birds, and the wild animals. And so we see a concern at the beginning of the Bible in Genesis with the ways in which words are being used and the ways in which words signify and symbol the power that people have over the objects that they're interacting with. Another issue is how often language came into being. Is there just one or two types of language, or are there many different types of language associated with different groups and cultures? And we can begin to reconstruct the earlier form of language, but often it's difficult to go back more than a few thousand or 10,000 or so years in the past. Of particular interest to us in the Bible of literature is that scholars are looking at the origin of written language, and they note that written language in the Middle East begins around 5,500 years ago, or 3,500 BC in Mesopotamia, in present-day Iraq. And early pictorial signs were gradually substituted by more complex systems of characters that represented the sounds of the Sumerian language of the Sumer people in southern Mesopotamia and other languages. And from 2900 BC, these began to be impressed in clay. And one of the easiest, quickest ways of doing this was to have a wedge or triangle shaped piece of timber, which was placed in the clay, and this led to cuneiform language. New discoveries have pushed back the date of writing in Egypt to close to similar time to Mesopotamia, and discoveries of large-scale incised ceremonial scenes of the rock art in Egypt date from around 3250 BC, around 5 to 5,500 years ago. 3200 BC onwards, the Egyptians also used hieroglyphs, which appear on small tablets and on grave goods in tombs. Earliest example of writing in China back in these 1000 to 2000 BC times have been found in many areas near the Yellow River near Beijing. And here, various dynasties have found that they have recorded various forms of writing. And so we have writing originating in many parts of the world. Some of the earliest alphabetic languages come from Egypt, Phoenicia, Hebrew, and then also a little bit later in Greece and also in Eastern and Southern and Western Europe. Alphabetic languages use the symbols of the most common sounds in speech rather than symbols for objects and actions, and rather than using drawings. And two of those sounds are a, and from which we get alphabet, and then b for the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is similar to the Greek. And so if we have a look here at Aleph, the first of the Hebrew letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and you can even see some similarity to our A. We use an alphabet in English as well. And then the second letter, B, bet. Notice that the Hebrew alphabet is written from right to left. Hebrew writing was from right to left, but there's a danger that this could get smudged. And so hundreds of years later, as the Greek writing developed, there was a movement of left to right writing, which we still use in English today. So the Hebrew alphabet, which is used in the Old Testament of the Bible, goes Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zain, Shet, Tet, Yud, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin, Pet, Trade, Ko, Resh, Shin, and Tav. And you may recognize some similarities between these Hebrew letters and also Greek and English letters that developed at a bit later time from these ancient Semitic Hebrew languages. Each week we'll have opportunity to consider a chapter of the Bible in either ancient Hebrew or Greek, or if you want to move straight on to the English translations, then that's fine as well. And you'll notice as you go to these interlinear copies of chapters in the Bible, you can move your computer mouse or cursor over the Strong's numbers for the words and over the alliterated word and over the grammar descriptions, and you can gain more information about the original words that we used. And you'll notice that you could also type in different versions of the Bible chapters, such as King James Version, New King James Version, Revised Standard Version, and New Revised Standard Version. And you can look up different translations of the scripture very easily today. Hebrew is a Semitic language. It developed in West Asia along with other Semitic languages, Aramaic and Arabic. Greek, on the other hand, is an Indo European language with similar letters, alpha, beta, gamma, delta. This Indo European language, called Romance languages, as they developed from Latin, Spanish, French, Italian, German, Russian, and dialects of the English Indian continent connecting across Europe. The ancient Greek of the New Testament is this more recent alphabetic language, and it shows greater similarity to English and other alphabetic European languages. And some people prefer to work with New Testament Greek rather than the Hebrew of the Old Testament, and it's easier to work with the slightly more recent languages of Greek. Before we begin looking at the literatures and genres of the Bible, it's also worth reflecting further on the nature of language and how we use it and what we do with it. Much of what we do in life involves the use of language, and our thoughts and our relationships and our activities are largely dependent on the use of words. Language helps us construct representations and models of the world around us and the ways we plan to interact with our world, cooperate and work with other people is through language. Cultural memories of the past and hopes of the future are also communicated through language. The ways people communicate goes beyond objective descriptions of what is there, to be expressive, to imagine, to be free, to come up with original thoughts. And we'll begin to explore some of this freedom in the ways in which biblical writers use language. Some philosophers argue that language is actually necessary for human thought. And as we look at language in the Bible, we might want to consider the ways in which thoughts are guided by language. Worldviews, too, are often guided by the language that is used within a culture or a group. And each person or group of people maintains a particular mental map of the world around them that is shaped by the language that is shared and used. This worldview helps a person make sense of their world and their position in it. And it's composed of all that a person believes and all the assumptions that underlie these beliefs. Worldviews function as perspectives and mental frameworks from which individuals see and interpret the events of the world around them and in their own life. The Canadian Catholic philosopher Charles Taylor said that language is constitutive of human beings. That is, we are language animals. And Taylor expands on the famous Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, showing how basic language and culture are to the ways in which we know other people and the material world around us. This is a reason why cross-cultural understandings require mutual learning, not just translation. And Taylor said much of the reality that exists in the way it does is partly because of how it's imagined and seen. And if you compare different cultural groups, more modern Western scientific thinking groups with more native peoples from different countries, you'll see that they've got different words, different terms that they use that describe the different ways in which they picture the words around them. It's not just a free-for-all of individual creativity. There are socially organised ways of imagining and picturing the world, and Taylor describes several of such imaginaries in his writings as they help produce and reproduce the worlds that people live in, including our modern world. The idea of a generalised market in which languages are competing is powerful. So is the idea of people, critical to democracy and legitimacy within political systems. They're part of the language we use, including the language of business corporations, partly because of the ways in which they are imagined. One of the most dramatic changes is the rise of what Taylor calls as an immanent frame, where we're focused on this world. This is a notion that everything in the world is part of a natural order, understandable without reference to anything outside of itself. It's a part of causal relationships. And this contrasts with a frame for understanding the universe in previous centuries and times that included a heaven and heavenly beings and mysterious and other phenomena. Phenomenological approaches, as used by French philosophers, continues to encourage an openness to phenomena as they're experienced by people, in contrast to the more reductionist, materialist, empiricist focus on language in modernist times. Within this modernist immanent frame, values themselves tend to be understood simply or more or less arbitrary as the subjective states of individuals rather than something broader. Nature doesn't have so much value. We either value it or we don't. We make a choice. Simply, we may value human life more or less, but as a matter of cause and effect relationships not having intrinsic value. And so we can see that the use of language can show different worldviews. And this leads us to the challenge of comparing Hebrew Old Testament worldview back at the time of Abraham and Moses through to the time of David and the prophets, and seeking to understand worldview that was behind the ways in which they understood their world and language, which could be different from the Roman Greek world of the first century and Jesus' time, which different again to the medieval world, different again to the world of 1200, 1500 AD and early and later modernity. Each of these times can see and use language in different ways, and it's important when we're seeking to read literature of scripture and interpret into our own times that we understand these differences in language and the ways it is used. In reflecting on some questions, I have some questions for discussion. Where do you think the meanings of words come from? Do they naturally occur within our thoughts and within our speech? Do they develop within cultures? Do they come from the ways in which children and older people grow up and seek to vocalize what they see? Do they mainly focus on that which is physical and material, or do they focus more on ideas? How can words be used in different ways to achieve different things? How do words gain public accessible meanings? How are these meanings accessed across different cultures and time periods and between different cultures, such as the Old Testament periods that we read about, the New Testament period, and our own periods and the different cultures in our world today? Can words have no reference at all? What is a thought? What are the elements in thoughts and how do they relate to language? Does language relate to thoughts and thoughts to language? Can we think without language? What's the relationship between words and the things that exist and the things that do not exist? These are some questions you might want to reflect on as we go on to look at biblical literature. They're not central, but there is scholarly writing on the philosophy of language and the nature of language that can be useful in our study of the language and literature that's in the Bible. Our communication is usually within social settings with dialogue partners. We might exclude some partners and include others. Today, some people might attend a group that's more creationist, world made in 6 days, or others, long time period for the origins of the world, or others, evolutionist. Often the people that gather together gather with people who hold similar views. And so the language is shared by them and they may struggle to communicate with others who hold different language. You might want to give some thought to the different languages used by different groups and the ways in which the different books of the Bible and the Old Testament and New Testament in particular is able to communicate the particular ideas that were valued by those people at their times, and how they communicate to us today in our times. I look forward to interacting with you further on the Bible and literature in the weeks ahead. Thank you for participating in this lesson. Thank you.